Questions about the scope and causes of income inequality have resonated loudly in the U.S. in recent years. Now, a new economics book about these issues is making a big and surprising splash of its own among experts and the public.
Perhaps the most unlikely bestseller in America, the English translation of French economist Thomas Piketty's 577-page tome, Capital. His recent U.S. press tour was likened to Beatlemania, with standing room-only events. Nobel laureates on stage with him piled on the praise.
It's a fantastic book.
Especially ones tilting left, who share concern for the global trend the 42-year-old Parisian has definitively documented: growing economic inequality.
Like it or not, you are considered geniuses, so take it.
So first, let's get into who Thomas Piketty is and why his research has been so influential.
So Thomas Piketty is a French economist that really kind of burst into the scene of the academic sphere in the early 2000s, working on the question of inequality and economic trends in inequality. First, he started off with academic papers, mainly doing work with his co-author, Emmanuel Saez, who's based out at University of California, Berkeley. And the two of them worked on the empirical measurements of inequality. Piketty became something of an academic celebrity, though, about a decade later. So in 2014, he wrote a book called Capital in the 21st Century that uses some of his own data work that called for an overhaul of international tax systems to address the problem of inequality, basically using progressive taxation to undermine and prevent the reconstitution of wealth concentration at the very top of society, basically the top 1%. And that book became something of a bestseller and thrust him into the limelight as a public intellectual in addition to an academic economist.
Okay. And so Piketty also, if we look at his background a little bit, he's been an economic advisor for people who are running in France for socialist parties. And so clearly he leans in that direction. So that's important to note.
Yeah, so he has advised several candidates for public office in France that lean in a socialist direction, as you know. His two frequent collaborators and co-authors, that's Emmanuel Saez, and then there's a third, Gabriel Zucman. They're both colleagues together at UC Berkeley. They've been advisors to political campaigns in the United States. So they were both offered economic consultation to Elizabeth Warren when she was running for president, and more recently as she's been promoting her wealth tax proposal.
Interesting. So now what you guys have done is looked at his research and basically gone about and seen what are the flaws here. And basically, if we could narrow it down to three things, it would be that there were some typos, right. Some misread definitions, and inconsistency, right? As well as just some very problematic assumptions. Would that pretty much narrow it down?
Yeah, so the background on all this goes to this 2003 paper that they wrote in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, and it became a very influential paper. It has thousands of citations. The basic gist of it, it tries to measure the concentration of wealth, it tries to measure the concentration of income for the top 1% of society in the United States, going all the way back as far as we have records. So basically the early 20th century. And what they show in this paper, or purport to show, has since become known as the Ucurve of Inequality, the Ucurve pattern. And it shows that in the early 20th century, you had really high inequality. It lasts until about World War II. Then it nosedives. And then it levels out at the middle of the century. and then it rebounds during the Ronald Reagan years, and then the idea is that the rebound is still continuing, and inequality is going through the roof as a result of that. And the major claim they make on the policy side of this is they have this U-curve, and they claim to measure the income distribution of the United States across time. And then they ask the question, well, why does it change? Why does it go from very high to very low from about the 1940s to 1980, and then why does it rebound again? And the answer they come up with is they say that this coincides with the high income tax rates of the mid-century. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt was in office for 4 terms as United States president, and part of his fiscal and economic package tied to the New Deal and also tied to the finance of World War II was he raised income taxes on the top earners to extraordinarily high levels. So by the 1940s, he had hiked them all the way up to 91% as the top marginal rate on the wealthiest earners. So that's all income above a certain level gets taxed at 91%, according to this the scheme that was put forth in the IRS. And Piketty and Sayers, in their paper, they basically say, well, it's those high tax rates that are driving down inequality. And then as soon as we got rid of the high tax rates, so they lasted until about the early 1980s, and Ronald Reagan famously overhauls the tax system and reduces it to, I think it was hovering in the 70% range by the 1980s, and he cuts it down to roughly where it is today, the high 20s and low 30% range for different brackets, and it's kind of hovered over there ever since. But the claim is that when taxes are high, inequality is low, and then when taxes are cut, inequality rebounds.
So now what you have done with the other fellows is found that there's massive flaws in this data and the way that they looked at things. And so basically you show that it's more of a teapot curve. So it's not as steep and as low. And so basically it's not as unequal as they are purporting it to be.
So that's exactly it. What we did is we reconstructed their entire data series. So we went back and we replicated it to start with, and then we found that there are errors. And the errors deal with how they handle tax statistics from the early 20th century in particular. So our paper looks at the first half of the U-curve, 1917 to 1960. That's the window we're looking at. And that's really the most momentous window in their historical narrative, because that's when the high tax rates are put in place. That's when what's referred to as the great leveling occurs. There's a drop in inequality in their series, and it's very rapid, a very compressed drop over a couple of years in World War II. So we went and looked at that, and what we found is they had made some very unjustifiable assumptions when constructing their data series in that period. Because, tax records, they get worse the further back in time you go, but there are at least some IRS records from about the 19-teens onward. That's after the income tax comes into place in 1913, so we do have some IRS records, but the quality gets really bad. And really, any time before 1943, 44, you've got some major data issues you have to deal with. The real reason, the issue there is in between those two tax years, between 43 and 44, the IRS overhauled how it did accounting. And what it did is it imposed the standards that we still use today. It's called an adjusted gross income standard. So when you file your tax forms, you're basically calculating your adjusted gross income. And that is the income you actually retain is a component of that, but there are all these categories of deductions that you are allowed to claim under the law, whether it's a standard deduction or if you itemize, you can take out things like charitable contributions, state and local tax payments, there's some interest payments that can be taken out, and a whole bunch of different categories like that. And almost everyone that has a tax accountant knows these categories. So to get the adjusted gross income, you have to actually have a very full, encompassing assessment of what's actually reported on the tax form. And what happened previous to the AGI switch that occurs in between 43 and 44 is the IRS used some different accounting standards. The main one was called a net income standard. So it's income without those deductions included in it. So the deductions are taken away, and it's what's left after the deductions, basically. So in order to reconcile the two, you have to do adjustments to the IRS records, the tax data that they are publishing in all years from 1943 and prior. And that means you have to go find and identify what was deducted and add it back in. Well, Piketty says didn't do that. That's a major problem that we found in their series, and we found a way to correct for those errors. The other thing they do is prior to the 1940s, the federal income tax eligibility threshold in the United States was very, very high. In some years, it was like less than 10% of families were even eligible to pay the income tax, and it's only the wealthy and upper middle class that this tax applies to. And that changes over time.
Wow.
So FDR, one of his major initiatives when he expands the income tax system, he also pushes it downward, the threshold downward, so middle class and then eventually poor people also have to pay income taxes. This is part of the World War II revenue ramp up. So it's really a regressive thing that FDR's never really associated with, because they like to present him as this great progressive who cares about the poor, but he really is the probably one of the biggest taxers of the poor in American history. But that's neither here nor there. What is interesting, though, is it has huge implications for all data before the 1940s. It means that the IRS records are fundamentally incomplete. They don't capture incomes from the middle class on down. And if you're trying to measure what share of society owns or receives a certain percentage of income, you're trying to measure the top 1% or 5% or 10%. Not having that segment of data is a big problem. So what we found is an adjustment that Piketty and Sayers had made to address that problem. What they did is they took a difference between, it's really complex accounting tricks that have to be done here, but they essentially apply a multiplier to their series that's based on taking the ratio of single filers from married filers, because there was a difference in the threshold they had to pay, and therefore you can estimate what's missing. Big problem, though, they chose the year 1942 as their index for this multiplier. And anyone knows what's going on in history in 1942 knows that's the first full year that the United States has entered World War II. And if you're trying to look at singled versus married filers to get a ratio, well, what happens to the single military age male workforce in the United States in 1942? They all enlist in the Army. So major disruptions.
That's a massive factor.
And you cannot use that year to project, say, what the workforce would have been in 1935 or 1925 or 1915. And yet that's what essentially they attempt to do. So we correct for that.
So it sounds like cherry-picked data in a sense. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with Ansel Keys and the Mediterranean studies, and he had done something that sounds similar. So he had gone in and said, okay, these are the countries who have these specific diets and they have a low BMI. And so this is the way that we need to be eating. And it contributed to the food pyramid to a bunch of myths around cholesterol and things that stayed in, government sponsored food pyramids up until now, basically. Yeah. And now people are finally starting to revisit that maybe 50, 60 years later. But I wonder if what's happening here is that they were looking for a result and wanted to achieve it, or if it was just shoddy research.
So I think it's a mixture of both. I mean, there are some errors that they make that actually, had they corrected it and done it the right way, it would have strengthened some of their statistics and the story they were telling. The majority of the errors, though, all go in one direction, and that direction is to augment the level of inequality in the United States at years that are convenient to their story. I don't think it's like an intentional fraud issue, but what I do think is going on here is they convinced themselves that they had a historical narrative that explained what was happening, and they went out searching for statistics to confirm that narrative. And as they're building up their statistical series, whether it's subconsciously or just through being sloppy or making some errors, they always happen to err in the way that that made their series look much more pronounced to the narrative that they were trying to tell. So it's discretionary choices all seem to go in one direction, and that direction affirms the notion of this U-curve and the notion of income taxes as this major instrument affecting inequality.
So I'm going to read from a short piece that was written for AIER which basically sums up your findings, which are over 40 pages. And it says, Piketty and Saez attribute the leveling of inequality to higher taxation and the curbing of wealth growth by upper income groups. Their research pushes for progressive taxation and indicts capitalism for exacerbating income inequality. They end their article with this omen. Our proposed interpretation also suggests that the decline of progressive taxation observed since the early 1980s in the United States could very well spur a revival of high wealth concentration and top capital incomes during the next few decades. So basically, that sounds to me like they are blaming all of the inequality problems on more free market-based approaches.
Right. Yeah, so these are guys that have convinced themselves that high taxes on the wealthy are great, and high taxes in general are great. They have genuine pronounced political grievances with the tax system that we have because they want it to resemble something more like what FDR imposed. And that comes through in their theory, but their theory very conveniently just happens to align with the policy prescriptions that they're seeking. So there's a circularity in it all. They have their solution and they have their theory behind it, and the theory seems to reinforce the solution. It's not the best way of doing objective social science. It's kind of putting the cart in front of the horse of the policy outcome that they want, and then going around and looking for statistics to confirm that.
Right. And that's what I find actually interesting about your paper, which is How Pronounced is the Ucurve, where you're really looking into, let's find out the real answer here. It's not, let's totally disprove that there's any inequality. It's, what are the factors for inequality that aren't mentioned here? And is this correct? Is the data correct? And are we being told the full story with the data?
Yeah. So the main finding of the paper is when we correct for all the problems we found in the way that they handled data, and this is mostly, again, between 1917 and 1960 that we focused on, although some other authors have looked at the later years and find similar things, similar problems. But when you correct for all of the problems in their data, it has two pronounced effects. The first one is it flattens the magnitude of the shifts in inequality. So there's still inequality and it still changes over time. No one's surprised by this. This is a recurring phenomenon of human history. So concentration at the top does fluctuate. It goes up and down, and it does kind of follow, we describe it as a T-saucer pattern instead of a pronounced U-curve when you look at the whole century in the United States. But so that pattern does tend to fluctuate, but it's at a much more subdued level than Piketty and Saez say. So that's the first implication, is the magnitude changes. The second implication is the timing of the shifts, because remember, their story is very centered upon the tax policy changes of World War II. They show a rapid decline in inequality in those years, and then a rapid rebound in the Reagan years when taxes are cut again. Our story actually shows that the shifts are taking place at different times. In fact, the main shift, the main shift of the Great Leveling in the first half of the century really starts in 1929 with the stock market crash, not a decade later when FDR has overhauled the tax code, and not the intervening years when he's raised taxes. It's actually before any of the tax hikes have started. You automatically see a leveling, and it's coming from what we're well aware of, and that is the Great Depression.
Yes, that makes more sense. Now, also, as somebody who's not an economist, just looking at this from the outside, I think, well, it would make sense to me that you would have, kind of more equality in a sense when you have all of these events going on, all of these crises and world wars, because everybody is pretty broke, right? So what I find interesting about anybody who wants to impose equality by taxation, by progressive taxation, is that they always seem to want to bring everybody down to a certain level.
They want to achieve what the Great Depression and the World Wars achieved through human disaster. So that's really kind of a depressing outlook on what the goals are here. Now they're saying, well, we can do this in times of peace. We can do this in times of economic prosperity by just using the tax mechanism. But it turns out the tax mechanism is probably the weakest of the causal claims that are being made here. Once you correct the data, it really just doesn't align with their timeline. But what is still there, what is pronounced is, in fact, the Great Depression has a huge leveling effect. It undermines and destroys quite a bit of the wealth that accrued through capital gains in the 1920s. So the first few years after the stock market crash, you see a very rapid leveling at the top of society. The top 1% loses astronomical amounts of money, especially on a year-to-year basis, on their income basis, for those first 3 or 4 years after the stock market crash, and that alone is probably the trigger driver of this great leveling. It's the main shift to pay attention to. And then, of course, World War II, it certainly has an effect, but it has an effect more so internationally because, the war, even though it is very stressful on the United States, it's stressful on the North American continent, it's not being fought here. It's being fought in Europe. It's being fought in Asia. And the physical aspects of the destruction of the war, the physical destruction of real estate and capital that's tied up into it, is playing out across the cities of Europe, for example. So you can have a leveling effect there, which is really interesting to study from a historical perspective, but it's certainly not something we want to celebrate as a cure to inequality.
Yeah, so I think that's really the point here, is that people would rather use taxation and intervention to achieve equality at all costs than to use an approach which is smaller government, which steps away from intervention and taxation, which allows the individual to flourish, and then as a byproduct, the people around them to gain wealth and for prosperity to grow that way. Basically, they're showing that there's more inequality when you have a free market. So they can't go for that. But is that really accurate?
It's not accurate at all. And here's a really interesting twist on the Piketty material. Some other scholars that they've been working with attempted to do the same type of a measurement in Russia, including the old Soviet Union, the Soviet years. So they also find a U-curve, that there's very high inequality before the Soviets take over, then it plummets down to nothing, and then it rebounds again after the end of the Soviet Union. And you're looking at this and you're kind of scratching your head. What's the story that they're trying to tell here? Well, they're saying, oh, the Soviet Union was much more equal. But we look at the reality faced by people living in the Soviet Union. It's one of the most unequal societies in human history. It means that there's mass immiseration. Everybody's poor except for the political elite, and they're all living in mansions, and they have their estates on the countryside, and have extreme luxury. If you're a political elite, you're a high-ranking member of the Communist Party, you're doing great. If you're anyone and everyone else, you're in abject poverty, you're facing famine, starvation, genocide, all of these terrible things. So the U-curve that they're depicting for the Soviet Union and Russia isn't measuring true inequality, it's measuring reported inequality, official statistics that are on the books. And those statistics give a very misleading picture about what its life is like living in the Soviet Union versus life both before and after the Soviet Union, when there are at least opportunities to escape some of the most horrendous oppression that existed in human history. So it's really kind of a perverse implication of the way that they are approaching this statistically, because one of the claims that would be made is that the Soviet Union should have been a great place where there's all sorts of equality, and should have been this like beacon of how society can be equalized and removed away from extreme wealth. And it turns out that the practical experience on the ground for those who live there is complete misery.
Right. That's a great point, Phil. And you have to wonder if the data points of the political elite in the Soviet Union entered into those studies.
Oh, of course they don't. Because they're not measured as income, they're not measured as personal returns. It's all favors that are provided by the government to the political elites.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So I also found that there was an opinion piece posted by Piketty just this morning. So it's called "The Western Elite is Preventing Us from Going After the Assets of Russia's Hyper-Rich." So he's turning his gaze over there. But if you actually read the paper, what he's talking about is having a top income earner wealth tax for the whole world internationally.
And, this has been a theme of Piketty's work, unfortunately, and really the political advocacy end of his work. So the further he's moved away from the academic journals, the more aggressive he's become in political advocacy. The old saying is that if your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Piketty's political work has kind of morphed into, if your only tool is high progressive taxation, every problem looks like it can be solved by the imposition of this giant global wealth tax. So whenever there's a crisis that comes along, whether it's the Russia-Ukraine situation right now, whether it's previous crises, he's made similar claims about things like climate change. He's made other claims about various political regimes that he dislikes in the past decade or so. And the narrative is always the same, that like taxes are the big fix to everything. I don't know if anyone's seen the old Robin Hood movie that Disney made in the 1970s, and there's Prince John, and he's got his bags of coins, and he's saying, taxes, beautiful taxes.
Taxes, beautiful, lovely taxes. Double the taxes, triple the taxes. Squeeze every last drop out of those insolent musical peasants.
Piketty is strangely become like a real-life caricature of this figure, and that taxes are the solution to everything. And a lot of the claims are just really tried, really tendentiously approached in the sense that he packages them like it's this magic fix-all solution, but the connection there it's just really not substantive. It's based on speculation and bad data.
Yes. And also to go backwards just a little bit to make sure I understand this well. Also, the data for people who were below the middle class, was that part of that as well? Did he enter that into his data at all? Or
yeah. So he attempts to do so, and I think every scholar that works on this attempts to try and figure out the lower and middle classes, the bottom 50% of society, because that's an important indicator. It does tell us a bit about human well-being. It tells us where income is being earned, where it's not, who's struggling. So very important to watch that in economic statistics. The data gets so bad the further back in time you go, it becomes very difficult to accurately measure it. So you start having to make assumptions. You start having to make fill in the gaps in the data with just basic assumptions of what you think it looks like. And that's not a very robust way of doing social science, even though sometimes it's necessary to accept a few of those assumptions. The problem with Piketty and Sayez's approach is their assumptions are all tiered again to confirm their political story. So when they're looking at the lower and lower middle classes, they're looking at the people that were in poverty or were maybe just making a very low scale income in the 1930s and 40s. And they're assuming that, this is a very large group of society that is not getting very much in return. The big problem with their assumptions there, though, and we find this is endemic in tax data really before 1943 or thereabouts, when the IRS starts to change enforcement around, is there's actually rampant tax evasion at the bottom half of the income distribution. The reason being, if you're poor and say in 1933 you're making $500 a year, which is like a lower class income, of course doesn't translate to today because of inflation, but $500 a year was not well off in 1933. And let's say that the threshold for a given year says that you have to report taxes if you make above $500 a year, and in some years it basically does fall in there depending on your reporting category. And you're not making much money. You are obliged under law to self-report this income, but if you also fudge the numbers a little bit and claim you made $490 instead of $500, the IRS is basically going to ignore you. Because tax evasion is very rampant in that era because there's no automatic payroll deduction. It doesn't come out of your paycheck. You have to calculate your income at the end of the year and fill out the form and turn it into the IRS. But if you can fudge your numbers a little bit and you fall below the threshold of what was required to report, you owe no taxes to the federal government. And I've done quite a bit of work on this in the 1930s and 40s. And what it turns out is once the payroll deduction is added into the IRS's rubric, when they're kind of self-enforcing rather than making you report your income on your own at the end of the year, suddenly people that are in these low-scale tax brackets, like the $500 to $1,000 tax bracket, they jump from, they basically like quadruple overnight the number of filers in those brackets. And what that tells me is that prior to that enforcement being the case, people were intentionally underreporting their income to avoid actually having to pay a tax burden. We also find evidence on this. Some states have separately administered state income taxes, and if you line them up side by side, their records against the IRS records, it turns out there are a lot more people filing at the state level than there are at the federal level because the state enforcement was more aggressive up until that point in history. So it's a clear story that there's underreporting of income at the bottom half of the distribution. And then when you're doing these full distributional calculations that Piketty and Sayers do, and they make the wrong assumptions about that bottom half, what does it do? It makes inequality look much, much more severe than it actually is.
Yes, that makes so much sense. So basically, when we're talking about tax the rich, that will solve all of the problems of inequality. We'll be dragging the rich down rather than elevating anybody. We need to drag the rich down. And what's happening is that we're seeing that it's not accurate either, that it's not actually about taxing the rich, but it's about what's actually being reported, what those numbers actually look like. And as well as where do those taxation brackets fall? I mean, if you start with progressive taxation, you start with the rich, then you have to keep going lower and lower and lower until basically you have the poor who are going to be heavily taxed to pay for all of these interventionist and spending programs.
Yeah. And that's absolutely the story of what happens in the Roosevelt administration. Again, he's held up as this hero of high progressive taxation, of fairness, of a friend of the poor, the New Deal. But what FDR's greatest tax legacy may actually be is not that he raised rates on the ultra wealthy, even though he did do that. It's that he imposed those rates downward on the poor. So at the beginning of World War II, almost nobody in the poor brackets actually had to pay federal income tax. It fell below the threshold. By the end of World War II, it's increased to about 90% of the population now has to pay federal income tax. That to me is a horrendous policy to inflict upon lower income brackets, upon people that are in need. And that's persisted basically since World War II to the present. We've alleviated it a bit with certain tax credits, but that's actually going against the old New Deal policy. And here you have Piketty and Sayers and his other co-authors like Zuckman that are espousing a return to FDR-style tax policy. I'm sitting here scratching my head. This was one of the most regressive expansions of the federal tax system in history. And that's not really a model to me of fairness. It's not a model of equity and of improving the state of the distribution across society. Rather, it's glossing over, and it really turns into an excuse, a rationalization for trying to get the most money out of the public, out of the taxpayers, and into the government's hands as possible. And then that's where we start seeing the flip side of this, because it turns out that, lo and behold, Piketty and all of his friends that work on this, not only do they like high taxes, they also like aggressive social spending. They like the Green New Deal. They like socialized health care. They like massive subsidy schemes for solar and wind energy. They like massive overhauls of the economy brought in under the public sector. So the tax story is a rationalization supposedly targeting inequality, but the other half of that story is they're creating a giant pool of money that they can spend on all of their pet projects.
So basically, we will tax you, and then we will tell you how to spend your money because you can't spend it for yourself.
That is exactly what they're after.
So what do you think the solution is for people who think that we do need to have more equality? What do you think the solution is?
Well, the first solution is I think we actually need to give up on this idea that the tax system is this magic box of levers that we can pull to shift the income distribution around society. This idea that the tax system can be used to socially engineer society needs to go away. One, it's not historically robust. It doesn't fit the actual data when you go through and correct it for all of the errors that they made. Number two, tax policy does have severe economic consequences when it's mismanaged. And that is, not only are you taking money away from people that earned it and giving it to the government to be spent much more inefficiently, to be spent in wasteful ways, what you're also doing is you're putting a macroeconomic drag on the economy. It's a contractionary fiscal policy. I mean, this is even the most diehard of Keynesian, left-leaning, left-of-center macroeconomists will recognize that raising taxes does have macroeconomic effects, including a contractionary pressure that does apply. So the idea here that you can sustain robust economic growth and prosperity and also radically increase taxes at the same time is a really dangerous formula here. You could a couple missteps and you're heading headfirst into a recession with this type of a tinkering that they're advocating, and yet that doesn't seem to even play into the equation of someone like Piketty and Sayers, because they're so interested in sticking it to the rich and getting the revenue that they think they can extract from that the broader well-being of society is almost completely neglected from their decision making.
What I always find interesting as well about people who advocate for these types of policies is that usually they're pretty wealthy. Mm-hmm. And the way that, they appeal to people who aren't wealthy, who are usually in the middle class, maybe even upper middle class, or maybe the poor, but I think that they mostly appeal to people who are pretty comfortable. And why do you think that is? Yeah. Am I right? Am I wrong? Do you think that that's an assumption that has any bearing in reality?
Yeah. Well, the economist F.A. Hayek had a great little essay where he explored this question. And the gist of it was that at all times in history, whenever there's been pressure for advocacy of socialism or a socialist revolution, it's never the working class, as Marx's theory would claim, that's leading the charge. It's never the workers themselves. It's always an intellectual elite who happen to proclaim themselves and appoint themselves as the advocates of the working class. It's the Vladimir Lenins. It's the Marx himself, who's really kind of a dilettante. Never really has a stable job in his entire life. He's living off of the income of his wealthy friends, and this pattern plays out across the history of these types of movements. It's always the academics. It's people that are living in the ivory towers, have reasonably well-to-do sources of income streams, and they pretend to care about the poor. I'd say that is absolutely true of someone like Piketty. He is a superstar academic in the sense that he's jumped into the public intellectual sphere. He is not poor by any means. He's, in fact, extremely well off because of multiple successive lucrative book sales, speaking tours, lecture tours, as well as a very high-end academic salary, and yet he's the guy that's leading the charge to be claiming to care about the working class. Same with his co-authors. You actually look up their public salaries at UC Berkeley, and I won't state what they are, but it's public records. These are people that are in the top 5% or the top 1%. These are academic elites with multi-million-dollar budgets and research centers behind them, and yet they're claiming to act on behalf of the poor. Something there just doesn't add up for me on the stated concern, and that's why I do start to question some of their motives. Is this really advocacy on behalf of the poor, or is this advocacy on behalf of their own political ideology?
So, what are your motivations in writing this paper then?
Well, I've always been something of a debunker of mythologies in both the historical sense and in the economic statistics. I've worked very heavily in that area. I have also worked in tax policy for many years, and especially historical tax policy. And when I started digging into this literature, when it burst onto the public scene and became very popular, became the trendy thing that everyone appeals to as if it were just a proven, demonstrated fact, what they were claiming did not align with what I knew from my own studies and my own research in IRS records, which prompts me to dig a little beneath the surface, to poke into their formulas and see how they came up with these numbers. And that discovery process alerted me that there were things that didn't pass the smell test. And the things that didn't pass the smell test turned out to have deeper, more substantive problems with them, including accounting errors, all the stuff that we've talked about. So that motivated me to go back and actually recalculate it and do it the right way, do it according to standard data practices that are very transparent, very openly stated forth in our paper. We try to document every single step that we do. And the results that we get are very different than the results that they were presenting as the accepted, standardized, factual truth for how inequality had played out in history. And it turns out, if you have a better data series and you look at the numbers, it has much more nuance to it, much more detail to it that doesn't align with the political narrative. It's more descriptive than prescriptive, which is what they're doing.
And that's really important to note because the paper that was written by Piketty is a paper that has been cited numerous times, and it's kind of become this standard in looking at income inequality. So what are your hopes for the paper that you've published as a rebuttal?
Well, I am hoping that our paper causes people who have previously just cited this, the previous study by Piketty and Sayers as if it's a matter of fact, to pause for a moment and look at the data and really come to the recognition that the data they were using just was not reliable historically. So we are viewing this as a point of the conversation, and Piketty and Sayers, if they're good scholars, if they're honest scholars, we're hoping they will engage that conversation, and hoping that they place a similar value on historical accuracy above the political message that they've been pushing. If they do, this gives us working room to get to a better series overall, to use our new data, our new calculations, and continue to improve upon it. And I think that gets us to a more accurate picture of history. What I would say on this, that's because it's been such a cited and heavily used paper, that means that their data series has been incorporated into hundreds, perhaps even thousands of other works that have made calculations based on it. What I would urge other scholars out there to do is to go back and recalculate your papers using our new series. Our new series is improved. It's more accurate. It has better, more transparent, and better justified data decisions that we do to handle some of the problems of historical tax data, and we lay those out. And we'd ask you to take our data, see how it affects your results, and if it changes your results, that should also affect how you present your interpretation. And I don't know the answer of what the interpretation will be in every single case. I just simply know that it is not the kind of simplified inverse relationship between high taxes and low inequality that Piketty and Sayers have been presenting as a result of their statistics, because the statistics are simply inaccurate.
Well, just coming from a perspective of somebody looking at this almost as a layman, it would be that when something seems that simple, it's probably wrong. There's always more nuance involved, and there's always a bigger picture that needs to be looked at. And if we want to address our current societal issues, we need to look at solutions-based methods that are accurate rather than what we want to see as being the solution.
Right. Set aside the magical solutions, set aside the easy fixes that claim to have a simple prescription that you simply enact this tax policy and you get what you want, and actually look at what the mechanisms are that are driving data across multiple interactive and complex historical events.
This is what Hayek would have called the cosmos,
Exactly.
correct?
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Phil. This has been a really great discussion, and thank you for joining me on Liberty Curious for this episode, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks.